You for coming to the session on apprenticeship reform, how to create an effective apprenticeship and skills levy. Now, there's been a lot of talk about apprenticeship and skills, not just at this conference, but at the other conference in Manchester a week ago, and I think that's largely to be welcomed. I think it is fantastic that actually more and more people across the political spectrum are recognising how important skills are to the future of our economy and how important apprenticeships can be as a means of delivering that. Here at Policy Exchange, we are firm believers in apprenticeships, and we've written on it several times this year. But although we think there are a number of good things about the current apprenticeship system, the standards, for example, have been well respected by many employers, we have to recognise that the current system under the levy is not delivering the number of apprenticeships that we need and the opportunities that our young people need in particular. So apprenticeship numbers have fallen, they are still below pre-pandemic levels, and if we look at apprenticeships for the young, by which I mean the under 25s, they are down by about a third on 2016 levels. In SMEs, they've fallen by about 50%. And that continuing falling number of apprenticeships, particularly for the young children, we're not delivering those opportunities, which young people are demanding. About half of people who register with UCAS say they would be interested in an apprenticeship, and of course many who don't register with UCAS would also be interested in an apprenticeship. But we're also at the same time hearing concern from business, which says that it is too inflexible to deliver the skills that they need. We know that in the modern world you don't always need to train someone for a year in order to give them the skills they need. Sometimes it might be 4 months, sometimes it might be 8 months. We need a wider variety of training. So we have a levy system at the moment which is it's not quite reaching its potential on both counts. And that's why Policy Exchange is very happy to be backing the Labour Party's commitment to move towards a growth and skills levy. And in our report, we have suggested a number of ways in which that can be achieved and in terms of the flexibility. We're here today to talk about nuts and bolts. We're talking about it is Labour Party policy to create a growth and skills levy, and we've got a brilliant collection of panellists, including 3 former apprentices, who are going to be able to talk and suggest their ideas of how we can start moving towards that system. I'm going to bring in first Lord David Blunkett, probably, almost, in fact not probably, but certainly in my view the best Labour Education Secretary we've had in the last 30 years, and who was very kind enough to work with us on our report and to write the foreword for it. So, Lord Blunkett, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Ian. I won't say I would sup with the devil if it got things sorted in terms of skills and apprenticeships, but you're not the devil, so I don't have to make that remark. I think what I'd like to do is to speak very briefly, because what Steve is doing here as the elected mayor of the combined authority in Merseyside, and what the apprentices have got to say will be much more significant, because it's actually there in practice. But in the learning and skills document that I led on for Keir Starmer, and there are copies alongside the Policy Exchange document, please take them. We tried to say that we need the nuts and bolts. We have a broad consensus, which is not shared by the present government, but a broad consensus on changing the apprenticeship levy. We had a broad consensus that apprenticeships is a good thing. We have a broad consensus that given 90% of new jobs are created by small and medium-sized enterprises, we've got a challenge to make it work there. But actually, what we haven't got and haven't been able to achieve is to get the nuts and bolts right to make it work. So part of the process that Policy Exchange have been engaged in, and part of this afternoon's interchange, is to explore what now needs to be done. There are some no-brainers in terms of making apprenticeships as attractive for young people as going into A-levels and university, or taking T-levels and going into work. And that also means changing the benefit system so that you don't lose out if you do an apprenticeship. It also means actually revising the apprenticeship payment system, which is chronic and is a disincentive. So we can get rid of some of the barriers, and they involve other departments, not just the Department for Employment or the Department of Business and Trade, but actually other departments being prepared to play their part. So it's a holistic approach, which is why Skills England will be important. But in the end, it's down to what is it that would incentivise, what is it that would make it practically possible for SMEs to be able to take on youngsters, and what would incentivise young people, not in theory but in practice, to want to do it. They'll go to PwC for apprenticeships. They'll take advanced apprenticeships at Sheffield or Warwick universities or elsewhere, Kingston and all kinds of university opportunities now. But what would it necessarily be to get a young person to think, I actually want to follow my instincts with a company, big or small, that will deliver on the ground in my community, not where very posh jobs are in the right part of London. And that's why, Steve, I'm pleased you're talking, because it's at the sharp end that it really matters. So you've seen the report. We've got proposals on the table, trying to unblock, trying to get people to work together. Just one final thing. In order to help SMEs, you need sometimes an intermediary, not a bureaucracy, but the gene therapy and cell therapy industries have created their own. You can do it sector by sector, and you could even get the revamped sector skills councils to be able to do it. And you can get the colleges and the private providers to be an absolute catalyst. So we did recommend a key role for further education colleges and, where appropriate, private providers to be able to facilitate and to be part of that generative programme of delivering on the ground. And if we can share this afternoon other ideas on how to do it, we might actually make it work. But we need to get those ideas together for the next 12 months, because we'll need to work, if we do win the election, we'll need to work really quickly on changing the whole atmosphere, the culture, if you like, the way in which people feel and think about what their part in this is. So over to whoever's next, Ian.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
We're next going to bring in Steve Rotherham, who was kind enough to sort of brave our platform at Manchester as well, and is now back on home turf. Former apprentice, mayor of this city region, and here to talk about not only what he's doing right now to support apprenticeships, but what he could do in the future if the broader national situation was correct.
If it was correct. It's great that you said in the opening remarks that people are starting to talk about apprenticeships, and everybody's talking about apprenticeships now, which is good. I still think we've got an awful long way to go before there's a proper realisation of that parity of esteem, and we can do more as a party, I think, to promote that. But last week I was with you at Tory party conference in Manchester, and it seemed to me that what the Tories were trying to do is defend the status quo, defend what they'd done with apprenticeships, rather than to look at where the improvements could be made. And that's the most important part for me. So great that Labour have now said this week that they will reform the system, and this excellent document that some people on this top table are responsible for really does start to spell out what we can do. And it's fantastic that we've started to think beyond just the apprenticeship levy. The apprenticeship levy is really important, and I've always argued that it should be, for me, a skills and apprenticeship levy. Okay, it's going to be a growth and skills levy, but I think what you need is the ability to do some foundation apprenticeships, to give people the prerequisite qualifications and an understanding of what it is then to go on and do the full framework. And the full framework includes, as people know, not just the technical and vocational skills, but lots of other things as well. And I think we need to tease that out more and give people the chance, when they are on the full framework, to achieve. We've got too many people dropping out, and I think that's because some of those targets, some of those qualifications and some of the units are quite stretching. So I'd like to see us do a little bit more on that. Look, I tried to spell it out on 2 panels. One to an MP, and I can't remember the lady's name, but she claimed that Brexit was the opportunity to do all of these wonderful things on apprenticeships, until I pointed out the fact that every single year since Brexit, the numbers of apprenticeship starts have declined year after year after year. But there's a lack of understanding on what happens. So you develop the framework, and then people just think that you can get people into those jobs. They really don't understand you need skills capital funding. So you need to either develop some workshop space or convert space that you've already got into what the needs of the future would be. You need to get people with occupationally relevant qualifications to train the people in the apprenticeships. Yeah. If you're a plumber at the moment, try and get somebody to give up 60, 80, 100,000 pounds and go into an FE college and get 35,000 pounds, and all of the associated problems that come with teaching people like me. But that's an issue for us. So what we've done in our city region is we did the LSIP, the Local Skills Improvement Plan stuff with government, but we went beyond that. So we asked our college and training provider base what additional capacity they had. So this is what we're going to do, but if you had limitless money, what else could you do in each of those occupational areas? So we've got that. So we know now what the skills needs are. We know what the capacity issues are. Then we've got the the business consultations, because we need to understand from the employers what they need. And then we've got young people. We've got lots and lots of young people who have already said they want to be, an A, a B, a C, a D, whatever. So we've got all of that. The last piece of the jigsaw, which should be the easiest piece to put into place, is the funding. And why do I say that? Because there's a £2.2 billion underspend. We believe it's actually greater than that. We think it's near £3 billion. But there's a huge underspend that's gone back into the general fund that the Tories are now spending on potholes or whatever they want to do. That should have been was raised, but should be spent on those skills shortage areas. And just as a last thing, I am 100% supportive of degree apprenticeships. I think they're great for some people as an alternative to going and accruing £40,000 in HE. For some people, that's the best route. But there's a heat map being done. Have a look at where the degree level apprenticeships and above are. The City of London and places like that. Well, in the City of London, those organisations would have already paid for those master's degrees or whatever, and what they're doing is substituting money they would have already spent and doing those qualifications instead. Now, it was supposed to be about closing the skills shortages and the skills gaps, and if it's being spent in those areas, they're not necessarily the things that we need to make Britain great again. And so what was just said on the stage there by Keir about getting Britain building again, we need a strategy around how we can release some of that funding so that we can have a pipeline of skills for the people that we'll need to do all of the building.
Great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. Really clear vision there. I'm just going to quickly pick up on one element of it, which was about some of that flexibility that you talked about. And just to say that in our report, we identified 4 main areas where we thought there could be flexibility. I mean, these aren't necessarily exclusive, but they are a starting point. One was around boot camps, which employers can contribute to anyway. The second was around smaller, shorter qualifications, so heat pump installation, HGV drivers, which are clearly skills, clearly employer relevant, clearly stuff that we need. The third one was the one that Steve mentioned around the sort of pre-apprenticeship training. We know there are a lot of organisations that do this anyway and pay for it out of their own pockets, but actually there are a lot of people in terms of the social mobility angle who need a little bit of help before they can get onto an apprenticeship. And then the fourth area was a link between the shortage occupation list and what the levy could be spent on. So we have a shortage occupation list, which we say, hey, here's some occupations that are in shortage and you can get a visa more easily to come in on those. Why don't we also say that as an employer, you can spend a levy on that to train up our own people. And we think that would be a way of meeting what Keir Starmer said in a speech last year, that he said that Labour would always welcome immigrants, but he also wanted employers to train up our own people as well, and to have both of those. So this would give them an opportunity to do that if they wanted. There may well be other good things that could be spent on, where, this is a contribution to the debate rather than anything like the final word on that. And I'm going to pass over to my next speaker, another former apprentice and a kind sponsor of this event. And this is Matt Brailsford, Head of Project Construction and Development at Mighty.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. So, yes, I followed a similar path to Steve, another former apprentice. I sat in electrical apprenticeship when I was around 17 back in Chesterfield. Small company put me through my apprenticeship and supported me in the whole journey. It then led me out to Australia, where I was one of the first involved in the fledgling solar industry. Came back to England in 2010 and set up Custom Solar, which became one of the largest deployers of solar energy in England, and now is part of the Mighty family. So Mighty, for those who don't know, Mighty is a facilities transformation business. We employ 64,000 people across the country, and at any one time around 1,100 of those are apprenticeships. So we massively support that scheme. In Liverpool at the moment as well, we've got engineering, horticulture and building management apprenticeships taking place. So the team that I'm part of is around 2,500 engineers, professional engineers that include design, installation and maintenance of many kinds of technologies, renewable energies, battery storage, electric vehicle infrastructure. And part of that, my interest clearly in apprenticeships and around green skills comes from the journey I've been with. Now, as impressive as all of those numbers are with the amount of people that we have and where we represent the country, I think we also have lots of skills gaps and people gaps. For us to help the country achieve its 2050 decarbonisation goals, we've got to get a lot more people through skills training, apprenticeships and variations to the levy as well. So decarbonisation services tend to be the biggest buzz that we've seen over the last few years, where it's a drive towards decarbonising clients' estates. And although the base skills of that being electrical and plumbing and everything that we've spoken about beforehand, there are gaps where we have a huge part of our workforce are quite trained for the future of energy. So we as a business, we welcome Labour's proposal here for wider use of the levy and to attract further growth into that area. And for me, there's three major areas that, although there's many areas, three major ones that we'd like to focus on and probably talk about today. So firstly is removing barriers to entry. So repurposing some of that levy to allow people to take on maths and English qualifications, which will launch them into that, because after all, that's one of the most underutilised groups where we think we could retrain and skill a few more people. Secondly, for us, is trailblazers. So as we're moving through with different technologies and an ever-moving ground space of technologies across the country, it's taking too long for the trailblazer courses to get through the bureaucracy piece. So realistically, it's 2 to 3 years for us to sign off a trailblazer, whereas we need them much faster. And thirdly is the businesses know what they need to deploy most of these goals. We're happy, we understand our skill force and skill set. And probably same point that we picked up on short courses, 80% of the workforce required to hit our decarbonisation goals are already working. They're already in employment. So are we going to ask people to sit apprenticeships over 2 or 3 years, or can we actually devolve into shorter courses, 2 to 3 months to retrain and reschool that workforce? So we believe there's massive opportunity here, and as I say, we support the Labour policy so much that we think we can really trigger the next retraining and regrowth of staff, but we do think reform needs to be now, and it's something that will play through quite quickly as we echo the needs to do this in the next 12 months.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matt. I think it's really clear from the industry voice here, and we spoke to a lot of businesses as we went about the report. There was this consistent need to train people and for that flexibility, which they're just currently not receiving from the support currently on offer. And then finally, to introduce our last speaker, Corianne Peasgood, President of the Association of Colleges and another former apprentice. Now, this is the first party conference season I can remember that both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition mentioned further education colleges in their speech. I hope it won't be the last one, but I think it's a great place from which to build. Corianne, over to you.
It is, Ian, thank you. And it's also great to be talking to you on day 2 of Colleges Week. So do have a look on social media and see the great things that our colleges are doing day in, day out for apprentices and students. And, I have to say I'm a real advocate for apprenticeships, and starting as an apprentice myself, as you said. And then when I moved into teaching, into further education, it was predominantly apprentices that I was teaching, and really saw how that link with businesses worked and how well apprentices got on when we had that. As principal, really championed apprenticeships within the college, so much so that we made sure we didn't subcontract any provision, but made sure we did what our community needed. And that included working with sector groups, and particularly construction and agri-tech, to make sure we were delivering the right apprenticeships. Because that's what colleges do as anchor institutions in their communities. They do the difficult stuff, and actually 60% of construction and more than 40% of engineering apprenticeships are delivered in colleges. I think when the levy came in, what we saw was that shift towards higher level, slightly older, mid-career apprentices coming through. Now that's not necessarily, as Steve said, wrong. And I remember one of our first degree apprentices in leadership and management coming through the college, who was a lady in her 40s who had her children. She'd worked at the same small demolition company in a little market town since she left school with just a few GCSEs. And her company invested in her, and they realised that they'd got a leader for the future that was already invested in the company, and by investing in her, they had a leader for the future. And I think that's absolutely the right use of the levy funding. But that's fine if it's in addition to young people. And I certainly think, when we've seen a 41% decline in 16 to 18-year-olds since 2015-16, that's not what we're seeing. We are seeing that growth at the expense of young people and at the levels 2 and 3. That's before we start to think about changes into a growth and skills levy. I think there are some changes that we need to think about in apprenticeships. So with the system, absolutely greater support for SMEs and for that bureaucracy. Seeing firsthand the amount of bureaucracy paperwork that goes behind just getting an apprentice to day 1 is absolutely mind-blowing. So we really need to tackle that. And then increasing opportunities for young people, because what we can't see is a further decline in having those opportunities that we know provide such great social mobility for young people. So is it targets that we need to look at? Is it more support that we need to put into the system, particularly with SMEs, to support those students, apprentices? And the third thing I'd say in the system we need to look at is more diversity. The white apprentices make up 86.7% of apprentices. In the population, it's 81%. And completion rates are far lower for disadvantaged people than they are for those with more privileged backgrounds. That can't be right. We have to tackle it. For colleges and providers, I think there are 3 areas of risk that needs considering to make sure that actually we're ready to move forward. One of them goes back to that bureaucracy and the audit and clawback risk of actually, are you complying with a system that is so complex? A lot of the apprenticeship funding is wrapped up in a team trying to keep you the right side of the line. In terms of those completion rates, it's actually sometimes quite out of control of the delivery organisation when you're thinking about a 4-year electrical apprenticeship. What can happen to a small company in that time? Very often the company's not there by the end of the apprenticeship. And the endpoint assessment isn't always valued. By the time you get to the end, young people have often got the skills that they need and don't need that final part. And then I will go back to the funding rates, because without being able to afford to pay for those specialist technical lecturers, it's just not possible always to deliver the apprenticeships. And I have sat in meetings with a construction sector group, just absolutely unable to understand why I wouldn't stop delivering anything other than construction apprenticeships. Stop delivering all that stuff for 16 to 18-year-olds. Get them to do apprenticeships. And that's kind of the decisions that have to be made, because as well as that £9,000 pay gap between college lecturers and school staff, so you've got a choice there. The pay gap between the 60 to 80,000 that you were just talking about and lecturers is even greater. And then for young people, I think there are some changes to actually really help them move through the system. Child benefit, let's look at the rules for 16 to 19-year-olds. Transport, I know we've done it in some areas, why can't we do it in all areas to make sure they get free transport to their apprenticeship? Scrap the apprenticeship minimum wage. I saw no end of young people who wanted to move into hospitality, and rather than do a hospitality apprenticeship on the minimum wage, they came to college and did a full-time course over 3 or 4 days a week, and then worked 3 days in the industry on the national minimum wage, a higher wage than they got as an apprentice, and moved into the industry that way. They found their way through the system. They shouldn't have to do that. They should have been able to do an apprenticeship. So that's all of those things before we think about expanding to a skills and growth levy. And what I wouldn't want to be doing is sitting here 10 years after the introduction of that and saying, do you remember when we used to have apprenticeships for 16 to 18-year-olds, because now they've dipped another 41% and they're just for the very, very few. So, welcome the broadening, but really think about the impact and unintended consequences.
Thank you, Corey, and I think we would very much agree with everything that you have said there. This is fundamentally what we want to do. We want apprenticeships, we want high-quality apprenticeships, we want more apprenticeships, and we want more flexibility for support for skills that aren't apprenticeships as well. And we know this is a driver of productivity, a driver of growth, a driver of opportunity. I'd like to throw open this panel now for questions from the floor, and I'll take them 3 at a time. So, David, why not you first? I think we have a microphone going around.
Thank you very much, and fantastic panel, and everything that's been said I agree with. I've got 2 questions really. One is, one of the lessons I think I've learned from this is the failure of giving all of the power to employers to run a system, right? Not because good employers aren't doing good things, so don't get me wrong, but what we've seen is a massive shift away from young people, a massive shift towards, as Steve was saying, fairly privileged people in the workforce who would have got that training anyway. And I think the lesson we've got to learn is we need a social partnership to run skills and education post-16. So I'm interested in people's views on that. Second is, everything, again, that's been said about the failure of the system to deliver the priorities brings me to the point of saying the new Skills and Growth Levy needs to have priorities set in it. Steve, I'm interested in how much you think you could have a role in that. So you've got an LSIT that sets out the priority sectors. You know where you need those really, really brilliant apprenticeships, particularly at level 3, 4, 5. And you've said already that you need to invest in those to make them work. Wouldn't it be great if you had some money from the levy to invest through colleges to build the capacity, build the demand, make sure young people are getting in there with employers, in partnership? So I'm interested in your thoughts on how far devolution of the apprenticeship levy for priorities, where there's a market failure, could help address some of these issues.
Thank you. I think the gentleman just there. Yep.
Thanks very much, Philip Brackley, Leonardo. There's 8,000 of us in the UK. 1,000 are on the early careers schemes, graduates and apprentices, and we have just increased our apprenticeship intake by 300. We've done that despite the levy, not because of it. And I wonder whether I might ask the panel to build on a couple of the observations that David and Steve made first. The levy is money that could be available to increase the resilience of our training base in the early careers network, and we understand that as bigger companies. It's not that we can't access our own levy, it's that no one can access our levy. You mentioned the parity of esteem, and the inability of anyone to access that means that we can't talk to the schools about the career opportunities that would be opened up. And I wonder whether I might link that, and perhaps slightly pessimistically, to the precarious nature of the further education college structure.
So could I ask you to keep it to a concise
Sure, and therefore the question would be whether we have an ability, and the current levy format to address the precarious nature of further education colleges and open up the supply chain to that access. And at the moment, I fear we don't.
Thank you. I'll take one more question, just there.
Hi, I've worked for FTSE 100 employers in the West Midlands, in the South West and the City of London, much as you may hate that, Steve. But one thing's commonplace in terms of I've run apprenticeship schemes within those organisations. And what struck me is that there's a focus on large organisations and apprenticeships, whereas what we should be doing is actually putting an obligation on those large organisations, like the one I work for now, support their supply chains in terms of levy transfer. Because that's the way in which you shift the dial. Because ultimately it's having the operational bandwidth to be able to help those smaller organisations navigate their way through, which is a minefield of bureaucracy, and opening up the levy to them through support for the large organisation, which then improves on-time delivery and quality across the piece. And that's how you crack this. And equally, going to the point around particular types of jobs being ring-fenced for levy, how about actually freeing some of that levy up to pay the salaries, either of the individuals on the apprenticeships or to backfill when those individuals are studying?
Thank you very much. I'll ask each of the panellists to address either one or more than one of the questions as they wish, and I'll start from this end with Corianne.
Thank you. And I'll start there and pick up the levy transfer. And I do think it is really good when larger companies actually work with their supply chain. And I've seen it work very well when there's good regional or local leadership, either through local enterprise partnerships or local authorities, where they actually become the broker in that, because it's not a straightforward system. Large companies and small companies don't have the infrastructure to do that, and to have somebody who's an absolute expert in how to weave their way through it, does work well. And by either doing it in their supply chain or for particular types of apprentices and things, I think it really helps, and you can see that working all the way through. So absolutely agree with that. I'll answer David's second question really around more devolution of the priorities for apprenticeships, and say I think it does work looking in the LSIPs particularly and what's coming through regionally as the demands. But what we need to be careful to do is to make sure that when we put all of those LSIPs together and go upwards, we're meeting the national priorities. And I think that's the missing piece at the moment. Some of those national priorities could easily be missed.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll just tag on to the back. I think that's a really good point, actually. So when we talk about the skills of the future, you could almost predict what those skills of the future are now. You look at things like energy transition, electric vehicles, renewable energies, you can pick them out already. But to a degree, as we spoke about earlier, we're already playing catch-up on those new sectors. So a number of these sectors have been going for 10 years. So to ring-fence what the opportunity is, I think we can draw out the roadmap for the next 10 to 15 years and actually start to deploy the right frameworks and the right levy spend in the right areas. So I think that will be interesting, I think, going forwards over the next few years.
Brilliant, thank you. Steve, over to you.
Well, I'll pick up on David's point first, but I'll come back to the point about the City of London. The strategic approach is really important, and it is about market failure, but also the strategic approach is about what's coming next. So a monolith like central government doesn't know what I want to do, and if devolution is to truly work, then that's why we need the flexibilities. So 2 quick examples. We got some money which was retrofitting money, and which is really good, and we won the largest pot in the country. But we did that because before we bid in for it, we knew that it was likely to be a pot of money. So we started to get local companies licensed to deliver, and then people trained in the qualifications necessary to carry out the work. Well, that's exactly what I need. If I build a Mersey-Tidal project, and it's a big if, because it's billions of pounds, but think about the energy security that provide for us. It gives us the capacity for harnessing the River Mersey for a million homes for 120 years. That's a price worth paying, I think. But who's going to do it? Because you've heard today about us wanting to get Britain building. The Tories talk about hundreds of major projects. Who's going to be doing all this? That's why you need skills strategies, and that's why the likes of ourselves can help with the market failure that we've already got and not exacerbate the skill shortages that this country desperately needs to resolve. And then just on the stuff, honestly, I don't hate anybody or anything other than VAR, as a Liverpool fan. But I do hate something, and I hate the fact that for far too many of our young kids, they are denied opportunity when there's a funding pot that's there that was raised specifically to do some of that. I'm never ever going to just accept the likes of that. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of kids in our city region who are desperate to do bricklaying or plastering or plumbing or whatever it is, or those great jobs of the future, which might be about some of the emerging technologies. Why can't we get this funding pot that was raised to do it and train young people who, by the way, just the same as you, I got my qualification. I went all over the world. I ended up in the Falkland Islands. I worked in the Falkland Islands in 1983 for 8 months. And it's life-changing. An apprenticeship is not the end of something. It's the start of something. It gives you transferable skills. It teaches you things other than your tool skills that you'll have for the rest of your life. Problem solving is the biggest one. For anyone in construction, problem solving is the biggest one. I guess what I use every single day. It's problem solving. So I think that an apprenticeship route for some people is the right way. It's not the be-all and end-all. I went on to do a master's degree later in life, so you can also do academia.
Absolutely.
It's horses for courses. And I just think that if we can get people on the first rung of this ladder, who knows what the possibilities might be.
Very good. I haven't got very much to add to that, except to say to David, we can develop quickly an architecture that incentivises and directs the resource in the areas most needed. And that can be done locally and not just nationally. It can be devolved if people are clear what they're talking about. One of the advantages of having the LSIPs is at least there'll be a foundation, inadequate as many of them are, there'll be a foundation on which to build very quickly, and with greater collaboration on LSIPs, and it does happen in most areas, we can then construct something that quickly adapts to the needs of the local labour market as well as nationally, and I think that's really doable. Otherwise, I don't think I've got anything else to add on that set of questions, except some of them don't have easy answers.
Very true. I'll take another round of 3 questions. Take the gentleman just there, and then the lady a couple of rows behind.
While you're doing the microphone, I ought to say that doing 8 months in the Falklands, Steve deserved a medal, really, because the weather there is how did you manage?
Well, bricklaying in the snow is fun.
Hi everyone, I'm Shane, I'm from FE Week, we write about apprenticeships. One of the issues with apprenticeships at the moment is that only about half of the people that start them actually complete them, which was a point that Corianne made earlier. Fully agree that the wage issue needs resolving, but I also wanted to come back to a point that I think Matt made, which was about this highly centralised 2 to 3 year process that we've got from a group of select employers getting together to develop a trailblazer and a standard, then getting it over the line to get an apprentice actually onboarded. So I'm wondering, given that in Greater Manchester we've got Andy Burnham with the MBAC, whether, Steve, you would support the idea of local areas having more control over the content and the development of local apprenticeships, or whether you think that would, whether that suits your ambitions for apprenticeships in your area, and what other ideas might be floating around to get people that can start an apprenticeship to actually finish it.
Thank you. So the lady just 2 rows behind.
Thank you. When Angela was speaking, I think she was very clear about all of us being accountable and making good use of resources and stuff around that, managing resources, managing money, finances, and all that effectively. So within the local authorities, some of them, you realize that they kind of lump a lot of different employees together for an apprenticeship, even for those who might not need it. So if you have like black people in the workplace, some have been really highly educated, they're highly skilled, they may not need apprenticeship. So I don't know who make the decisions. They might be in a job where somebody needs something as simple as functional skills, English and maths, and they are overqualified, they don't need it. So you're just bringing your attention to this. Lumping everybody together doesn't help. Focus on those who really need it so that you can get more people to get into it. And then those who are already highly skilled could serve as mentors or, we could be mentoring or like encouraging, especially when me sitting here and hearing you say about half of the people who begin do not finish. I work with children in care. Young people in care need a lot of support. And so if we can identify those people and then bring them into the sector and fund them instead of wasting, I see it as a waste. So I'm just bringing your attention to that.
Thank you. And I think we had a question just there, gentleman, just there, in front before. No. Sorry. There. Thank you.
Hope you send Warwick Manufacturing Group. One of the challenges you identify in your report is that we fund higher education and apprenticeships very differently and very separately. We're seeing a big reform in post-18 education funding coming with the lifelong loan entitlement. How can we use the lifelong loan entitlement to support the creation of more technical and foundation apprenticeships and not undermine it?
Great. 3 great questions there. I'll go in the other way this time and start with you, David.
I'd like to pick up on the apprenticeship dropout rate. I think we've got to be much clearer. We need much better data on whether this is partly that the apprentice has taken the wrong route. This is not a job for them, which involves testing jobs much more, giving a taster and the early entry. It involves much better careers and information guidance and people knowing what they're talking about. It involves schools actually being able to give that taster, not just the 2 weeks work experience which the parties committed to, but actually much more imaginatively using social media and new technology to be able to experience and explore those kind of jobs. And it might also be that we need the passport that we recommended in the Learning and Skills report that I led, which would allow people to build incrementally and through a modular approach, which brings in a little bit the final question about the lifelong learning entitlement, where you can actually, you don't lose what you've already done. If you've moved on to another employer because somebody's offered you higher wages, you could continue your learning in a different environment and still get the credits for it. And I think we've got to do this a lot more. I mean, if you take an open university degree, if you start on it, there are universities that will allow you to go into year 2 because you've notched up the sufficient early entry requirements to be able to do that. We need to think really creatively about how we can make this work for the individual and not just for the system. On the LLE, I think we're in the very, very early stages, aren't we? I mean, we just took the bill through the Lords. It's now an act. It's a framework, but there's nothing inside the framework. And we need to build on that. And sometimes I'm in favour of individual learning accounts where employer, government, individual actually make a contribution and build up an entitlement. I'd be in favour of auto-enrolment for education throughout life. But if we're going to do that, we need to be much clearer about which route requires what funding and how we help people who are struggling in the job. I think sometimes it may well be that the employer just doesn't have the capacity to provide that mentoring and support that was inherent in the final question.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
There are a multitude of reasons why some people don't complete their apprenticeship, including that some companies, once that individual becomes in their eyes competent at doing the job, they release them because they're losing the productivity of that individual for that one day when they go to back to college for day release. So it's not always the case, of course, but you'll find a lot of that happens, and it happens a lot in construction. And I have got an idea to build on what David was talking about, which is the modular approach. I worked for something called the Learning Skills Council. People might know that many years ago. And you
invented it and then it disappeared. It got centralised and jiggered the original proposal.
The whole philosophy of it.
Yeah.
But what I did was I got something called a carousel approach, where the funding that we had went to the company that started to train somebody. But then if that company wasn't able to complete the full training, the residual funding went to company B or company C or whatever. And the great thing about it was that apprentice got training not just in one company, but in many more. And as long as they could complete, because it was CSCS, if you remember at the time, you had to get your proof of competence card to go on a building site. And so we did that, and we saved those people, because many construction companies haven't got the longevity or the guarantee of a contract for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, whatever it is for some apprenticeships. So you need to be flexible, and that could happen with a more modularised approach to this. I'd just say on the point about diversity in the workplace and about how we fund skills, the first thing that every company should do, is retain that workforce. If they retain it, they save money in recruitment and all that sort of stuff. But then I'd do retain, retrain, upskill and reskill. So retraining people, those who've moved occupations, upskilling, MVQ level 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 or whatever it might be, and then to reskill people because there's been technical developments in the occupational area. If you did that, you could make apprenticeships really work.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, if I can, I'll probably address the diversity and barriers to entry piece, because I think it probably it touches on a few issues that would ultimately need to be solved. So just speaking for Mighty for a moment, we employ 147 nationalities of people, so we've across the country cover a huge breadth of people and locations. But at the same time, we're aware that there's so much returned levy, and I'd agree with you, Steve. I think it's closer to 3 billion. I think I've got 3.3 billion over a 3-year period, which is a huge number. But for some of the entries to join onto apprenticeship courses, maths and English will be a prerequisite that sometimes can be a barrier. So to open up the levy to utilise spending there, we'll start to draw more of that apprenticeship levy back towards spending and not handing back. Another point as well that was brought up was around business joining with education to solve some of the skills gaps. So to date, 634 apprenticeship courses have been raised via businesses to try and close those skills gaps, but there are still many skills gaps that need to be closed before there's a fully rounded apprenticeship system. And I'll end with this, I think, to probably prove the point where it joins all the dots is 2 out of every 5 people in the UK, so 40% of people, don't have the right skills for the job. So for us to train people and give them the skills, it should give them a level of protection for their own education and their own forward-facing career, that they have the right qualifications. So we shouldn't always think, what do businesses need? We should be thinking, what do people need, right? Because people will work for many businesses over the lifetime. So hopefully that addresses that point.
Thank you. And Corianne.
Yeah, and I think I'd reiterate the importance of the initial setup of the apprenticeship with both the individual and the business. So is the individual clear about what the job is, what the requirements are? And very often they're not, particularly young people who haven't seen some of the jobs that are out there in the world of work. I think, as David said, really looking back to pre-16 work experience so young people get that broader view, I think is really helpful. And I think it's also talking to the employer about what will need to be covered in the apprenticeship. Actually, are you going to get 3 years into some of these very long apprenticeships and say, well, we don't do that, we never have? How are you actually going to get through that? but also looking not just from a deficit model, so what somebody can't do, no, they haven't got the maths or English so they need to do it, but what technical, vocational, professional skills have they got that they can do? And actually, as you say, it might not be the apprenticeship that they need, and actually that could lead to being demoralised when you're on it, dropping out because actually it's not challenging, it's a bit boring, it's not hard enough. So I think it's really getting that initial assessment right. And then on the apprenticeships, I think, as other panel members have mentioned, there are no stopping off points, and particularly with standards, if there are no qualifications in. Thinking about some of the engineering and the electrical installation apprenticeships, it's 4 years, and you get to 3 years in, and for whatever reason, personal reasons or to do with the employer, you can't complete. You're left with nothing.
Crazy.
And, you need to start again. So, and the final thing I'd say about while you're on the apprenticeship to help with the dropout rates, where we see it working really well is where you've got the great relationship with the apprentice, the provider, and the employer. And not just somebody in an HR department, but somebody that's actually working with the apprentice day in, day out. And that's not an easy skill. To be a mentor for an apprentice is not something that everybody finds easy. You can be brilliant at your role, but teaching somebody else to do it doesn't always work. So actually, I think particularly in SMEs, where that would just be a little bit of somebody's job as opposed to in a very large company that might have roles to do that, it's really making sure that they are provided with the support to support the apprentice. Can I just pick up on the lifelong learning entitlement as well? I think for adults over 18, we've got kind of 3 sections that we can look at in terms of those real first-rung community learning. We've then got the more traditional qualification-led level 1, 2 and 3 learning. And then we've got what will happen with the lifelong learning entitlement. But at the moment, they don't join up, and people can fall off in between them or can't move from one to the other. So I think we really need to make sure, when we're developing further the lifelong learning entitlement, how you get an 18, 19, 20-year-old, 36-year-old who didn't do brilliantly earlier on in their life. They've got all of the skills to move on, but actually might need a top-up of something at level 3 before they move on. And if they can't do that, they're never going to be able to access their lifelong learning entitlement.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think I've got time for maybe just 2 more questions. I'll take the gentleman just there in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name's Robin Clark. I'm from WMG at the University of Warwick. I'm particularly thinking about green skills for some of the newer jobs. In subject areas where there's alignment with respect to those particular subjects, where some of those subjects might require some capital investment in order to provide the right learning experience, quality learning experiences, where there might be shortages of staff. Should we be challenging universities to step up and work more closely with colleges, enable the aspirations of the learners to be raised, perhaps make more connections with companies, and hence provide something of a regional ecosystem to support what we need in the skills sector?
Thank you. And the gentleman just to the back.
Hello there, I'm Andy Sowerby. I'm here as a CLP delegate over in Lincolnshire, but my question is from the point of view of a dad whose son would be a user of this potentially. Through quite a good careers piece, he discovered about apprenticeships and advanced apprenticeships. He's quite set on what he wants to be. He wants to go into cybersecurity. I think he likes the idea of being legally allowed to hack people. But anyway, but when we looked it up, trying to find apprenticeships for that, the only one we could find was one which looked very good with Jaguar Land Rover, but that meant travelling from Lincolnshire to Coventry and a couple of other sites as well. So part of the question is we found it very difficult to find providers, so it's about how that would be simplified. And admittedly, the local college wanted us to go and find the company before we applied for him to do an apprenticeship with their college, which was quite difficult for somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And the other one is when somebody is so set on their ways with a career, being over in Lincolnshire, it can be that you've got to travel to do that. And what sort of support? Because you almost become like a university student and need similar support to be able to follow that career dream. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question to finish on, and we'll start. If I could ask each panellist 1 minute maximum for the questions and any final thing they'd like to say.
Okay, so the first one, I hope we heard some of the answer today with the technical excellence colleges that we were talking about, thinking about what's needed in an area, and if the funding comes with that, to put the resources in for what's needed at level 4 and above to really provide those specialist skills in a region. Hopefully we've got that. I think along with the potential for universities to really be tied into the LSIPs in a way that they're not now. I think, the combination of those two things. I'd also add putting several of the funding pots together. At the moment, they're so specific for HE innovation, for FE, for the Learning Skills Improvement Fund, prior to that SDF. If we just had one pot to spend what was right in a region, I think the money's probably there. And in terms of apprenticeships and finding those opportunities, it is a job, so it is finding the employer as well. I would say, I know you did it, but I would say talk to your local college. They often have the links and can also point out some of the other qualifications that could be done if you can't find that in your area, like some of the T-levels with the industry placements in some of those companies, and young people often go on from those and get great higher apprenticeships or jobs.
Thank you.
I'll try and pick up the part around specific courses and what we would deem trailblazer courses for where we have an apprenticeship gap that we'd like to close. I've got colleagues at Mighty that are forcing through a few trailblazer apprenticeships at the moment. One, which is the telecoms area that we deploy work into, has taken 2.5 years for us to get through the red tape that will allow us to deliver a new trailblazer apprenticeship. So I think it's fair to say the appetite from business is there to close these gaps and work with people to do them. But at the moment, the time is too intense. As you'll find out with your son, you probably need to find you're finding the business, finding the educational path and joining the two together. And very quickly, around gaps in jobs specifically and around retraining for people, I'll hit one kind of statistic with this is ground source heat pumps that we know are going to be a big green skills development piece at the moment will need around 150,000 installers for that technology by 2030. There are currently 3,000 people, but there are 140,000 trained gas engineers. So by redeploying a short course, I think we can turn the ship to address the problem.
Brilliant, thank you. Steve, final words from you.
Should we engage better with employers? Absolutely. And if we had some flexibilities, which we keep on saying, then we could do that. It's an ecosystem. If you take away one of those pieces of the jigsaw, it actually doesn't work. So we're the only people at our level in areas that do have combined authorities that can look strategically and pull all those bits together. And all we need is a government with the same ambition that we've got.
Thank you. And David?
On the second question, I think there's a role for business account managers in FE and the equivalent in the alternative provider sector to actually be able to work with employers in the development. But what we haven't mentioned, and I will very quickly say, is that we need to flex up and change the model, not necessarily doing away with it, but change the model of the Institute for Apprenticeship and Technical Education, because the nature of approvals is clunky, and the people in there know it, and we've just got to find a different way of doing it, including authorisation and decentralisation, where that approval mechanism can be properly verified for quality. On your first question, colleagues in higher education would hate me for saying this, but we should open up facilities in the evening and weekends from universities. Going home at 5:30 is not good enough. It wasn't when I taught in an FE college, but it is now I teach in HE. So, there's a massive capital asset out there with our universities. If they are going to be the anchor institutions that they want to be, then they've got to open up the facilities and make it possible for both business and colleges to link with it to make it work.
Thank you.
Some good colleges do, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to say a final word, which is picking up on that final question that we had there. And I think it touched on so many of the things that we've talked about. We've talked about the decline in apprenticeship opportunities for young people in particular. We've talked about what David said about how we can't leave it solely up to employers to decide where we want to have apprenticeship opportunities. Of course, we want employers to be in the lead in terms of what skills are needed. And actually, the sad thing is that if your son wanted to go to university to study cybersecurity, there's a very good bet they'd be able to do so, because there are a lot of courses around the country in that. But there are very, very few apprenticeship opportunities. And I've nothing against people who want to go to university, but I think I would like there to be a genuine choice. I'd like there to be enough apprenticeship opportunities in every area of the country that those people who want to do it and to have the skills from school to do so are able to get there, and it becomes as easy to pick up onto an apprenticeship at 18.
And do what Steve did, which is to do both.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah.
It could then go on to do both. They
Yeah.
have a genuine choice
Yeah.
between it, and if we can get to that situation of a genuine choice, that would be a really welcome thing. So thank you to all of our panellists for not just their work on this panel, but for work which they've done with Policy Exchange previously as well. And if you could show your appreciation to them in the usual way.
Could we share another cup, probably?